Hello, everyone, and welcome to our third panel of the week for MEI Climate Week 2023. My name is Mohammed Mahmoud. I'm the director of MEI's Climate and Water Program. And before we start, I would be remiss if I do not wish everyone that observes a happy Eid Mubarak, which actually happens to fall on today. We are the Middle East Institute, so we at least need to recognize that momentarily. So today's panel, and we're midweek, and sometimes a lot of the pressure is on the midweek panel because that's we're halfway through, but it's a really intriguing topic we have today. And today's focus is on the climate and security nexus in the Middle East region. We certainly think of those things a lot, but for most of us, and maybe not necessarily most of us, for a lot of us, we don't necessarily connect them together. But there is a very important intersection point. And so today's panel, we're really looking at how climate and the implications of climate can truly affect security and pose challenges for the region. And impacts of climate can manifest in ways such as political instability, conflict, as well as implications to natural resources that are critical for populations in the region, that also threaten the security aspect of those nations. Things such as food insecurity, water scarcity, and of course, let's not forget natural disasters that occur, both intense and short-term, as well as those that are more longer-term and brewing. So these challenges really affect how the region is able to persevere, and for the different countries in the region as well. So let me not talk any much further than that. I'll leave that to our esteemed panelists. But before we get into that, I'd like to introduce our moderator for the day, who will then take us through the discussion with our esteemed panelists. So our moderator is Dr. Yulia Sabina Joja. She's a senior fellow and director at the Middle East Institute, particularly specifically for the Black Sea program. She also serves as an adjunct professor at both Georgetown University and George Washington University. She specializes in European and Black Sea security, but I would further say in security as a whole. It's a big part of her expertise, because also prior to her current roles, she served as an advisor to the Romanian president and also as a deputy project manager at NATO Allied Command Transformation. And so her work at MEI really brings a critical analysis to developments and implications on regional security. So with that very brief introduction, I will hand it off to Yulia to move us forward today in the panel.
Mohammed, thank you so much for the very kind introduction, and to all of us or to all of you joining us today, good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, depending on where you are, and welcome. It's my pleasure to welcome you all to today's event, Climate and Security Nexus, as Mohammed mentioned, kindly and generously also hosted by him, Mohammed Mahmoud, in his Climate and Water program, where he serves as director and senior fellow within the Middle East Institute. We'll be talking about some examples of the increasingly prevalent and visible nexus of climate change and conflict in the MENA region. And we'll discuss specifically water scarcity and conflict, as well as food security. And finally, last but not least, I'll also ask our distinguished panelists to look forward into the next few years in terms of climate security challenges, and also recommendations of how to mitigate some of these risks for both governments and the non-governmental sector. So I'm very honored to be joined today by our distinguished panelists, Tom Ellison, Deputy Director at the Center for Climate and Security, Miret Mabrouk, Senior Fellow and Founding Director of the Egypt Program here at the Middle East Institute, and Tobias von Lossow, who is a Research Fellow with Klingendale in Europe. To read their full bios of our distinguished speakers, please visit the MEI website. And I look forward Last but certainly not least, I look forward to taking audience questions through the Zoom's Q&A feature, which you can all find on your screens. For those of you calling in by phone or watching our panel on the live stream, you can ask a question by emailing events@mei.edu or tweeting us at MEI. And if you have any technical issues or questions, again, please email events@mei.edu. We'll be structuring today's panel with a few of my questions for our panelists, but I'm keen to engage with our audience today and factor in as many of your questions as possible. So please do send your questions for our panelists, particularly here on Zoom. And with that, I would love to kick off the conversation with a few examples around which we can really think about and conceptualize climate change and conflict. And Miret, perhaps I can ask you first. You're focusing primarily on with your work at MEI on Egypt, but also on the Horn of Africa and Sudan. Can you tell us a little bit about climate change, how it is affecting the Horn of Africa and Egypt as well, and how the Sudanese crisis might play into the wider region in this context?
Thank you so much for asking me on today, and happy Eid to everyone. And from happy Eid, we move on to a slightly less happy subject. In most nations, and particularly developing nations, and particularly the nations of the Middle East and North Africa and the Horn of Africa, political security is linked to economic security, is linked to food security. All of that leads into stability. And therefore, what happens with climate, what happens with food security, what happens with the economy is all inextricably linked. And what that means is you get one bad event and you have serious problems. The Horn of Africa at the moment, we'll leave Egypt a little later, because I know that you're planning on asking on Egypt, but the Horn of Africa has unfortunately had one bad event after another. It's currently experiencing the worst drought in recent history. We've had 4 consecutive failed rainy seasons in Ethiopia, Kenya, and Somalia. You have conflict. Ethiopia still has a civil war going. You have conflict, you have insecurity, you've got staggeringly high food prices. The last rainy season was the driest on record for the last 70 years. You have almost 40 million people in the Horn of Africa that are in urgent need of life-saving and sustaining assistance. And you've got 23.5 million who are enduring 23.5 million people who are enduring really high levels of food insecurity. Almost 4.5 million children expected to be malnourished. You have challenges accessing clean water. Of 51 African countries, I think 27 do not have appropriate and integrated water management and sanitation systems. I mean, it's quite awful. The situation in Sudan has exacerbated it for several reasons. First of all, in Sudan, the conflict has caused an uptick in refugees. More than half of the population requires humanitarian assistance. You have 670,000 people potentially affected by sudden onset disasters. You've got water shortages, but more importantly, Sudan was a producer of food, particularly of livestock, that went to the Gulf, to China, to India, to its neighbor Egypt, and all of that has been upended by the war. Sudan's gold exports have been upended because they require shipment, and all of this has been exacerbated by the fact that what agriculture there was has been severely denigrated by climate change. In fact, I think the African region is the only one that has seen a drop of almost 32%, no, over 34%, I'm sorry, in agricultural produce since 1960. That's just around the corner. So all of this means extreme poverty, rising poverty. It allows for non-state actors and terrorist groups to, go through the door. So what you're looking at is a really, really bad mix of climate change, politics, and insecurity that is, but I think, reaching fairly awful levels.
All right, thank you for giving us this overview. As terrible as this sounds, it's also a very complex one, complex picture that you're painting, and I'm looking forward to asking you more details about that through our conversation. But first, I'd love to go to Tobias and move geographically a little bit to Iraq, that I know you, Tobias, are focusing on, and ask you about the climate security nexus in Iraq specifically. If you can, again, try to paint a bit of a picture for us and for the audience in terms of what that consists of, what the major challenges when it comes to climate change and conflict in and around Iraq consist of.
Yeah, thank you. I mean, the situation is similarly complex as what Miret just described for the Horn of Africa. And I mean, we see on the one hand a lot of different factors and impacts on the security side. We see a fragile security situation. We see a very dynamic situation at that end, and we see a lot of things happening on the other side, on the climate hydrological side. And so a lot of events and impacts here which are accumulating, and at a certain point they come together and illustrate very often what the climate security nexus is all about. And there is, of course, one very prominent example from Iraq, the so-called 2018 Basra protests, which, let's say, the bigger narrative is that, the climate change and the heat wave at that time contributed to steer unrest and violent protests. Just quickly looking into what happened back then. I mean, that heat waves are nothing new to the region, particularly southern Iraq, a very vulnerable area, and it has been hit by heat waves over the last decades repeatedly. But 2018, over the last years, the frequency increased, the intensity of these extreme weather events increased. And 2018 was a particularly bad heat wave. It hit the whole region, the whole Middle East. But in Basra, the people experienced between 45 and 50 degrees Celsius over several days in a row. As a consequence of this, also this regional heat wave hitting the region, water and electricity supplies went down and were cut off only to a few hours per day, while of course at the same time the demand was increasing for industrial purposes, for cooling systems, for the water for the households, etc. So people were more and more struggling and suffering in this particular summer 2018. More than 118,000 people were hospitalized and with waterborne diseases and symptoms of waterborne diseases. And so that the living conditions which in many cases were already quite harsh, even further worsened. So at the same time, we saw anti-government protests taking place also in the years before. And the impact of climate change and water shortages and insufficient public service supplies were only one factor. There was a broader discontent with the government. There were anti-corruption protests also in the years before. But during this summer, it accumulated that given that this personal experience, this individual experience, that almost every family had one or two people directly being directly impacted by climate change, and these the consequences brought people a higher and larger number of people on the street, which were not joining the protests in the previous years or in the very beginning. And so that gave rise then also to a bigger movement that later on throughout the year also spread into other regions in Iraq. And so it's just one example that illustrates how how the security situation or the insecurity and the climate change and the impact are interconnected, and that they that this whole situation as such deteriorates in such settings.
Yes, thank you. And for drawing also this picture of political overlap with the consequences, the immediate consequences of climate change. If I can ask you just a very quick follow-up question. When it comes to the systems failing, the way you're describing that then led to increased and amplified protests, has there been, it's been now 5 years, has there been any reckoning at the governmental level? Have there been any changes made to be able to mitigate future risks of that?
Well, in the years after, there were some efforts by the central government to address that. There were also some financial resources that were made available, but all in all, it was quite a slow process. And of course, given the scale and scope of that experience, of course, it was not enough and not sufficient to address all these related challenges. And of course, you cannot prevent it from happening again, even if you have a lot of money and tools in place. What we see over the last 6 months, 10 months now is that climate security, climate change adaptation is a bit higher now on the agenda of the not so new, but new Iraqi government. So there is a lot of, let's say, public commitment by the government that they want to do more. They held a climate event in Basra earlier this year. So we see a bit more, but also, let's say, the implementation and the follow-up, and also the appropriate reaction to scenarios and what we have to fear in the near and even in the far future. There are also a lot of uncertainties that the government, but also other actors have to deal with.
Thank you. And then turning to Tom and staying within this remit of examples of, or very illustrative examples of climate change and security. Tom, I want to ask you about your sub-region of expertise, particularly Turkey and Iran. Would you be able to talk us through some of these examples of how climate change leads to reduced security and possibly conflict?
Sure, and thank you for having me, and Eid Mubarak, as others have said. I'm happy to be here. And I'll maybe make a couple framing comments just to build on what I heard before as well. Just I think a theme that's coming out already and that will come out is, the idea of how interdependent and interactive all these systems are, right? That climate change is never the sole cause of conflict, just like no single thing can ever really be called the sole cause of conflict or a security challenge. But it's this increasingly important variable impacting, food and water and governance and all these other systems that we're really realizing quicker and quicker how interdependent they are. So when you have that combined with these other pressures, population growth or inflation or resource mismanagement, like we've heard about, those things can compound and cascade in unexpected ways. And unfortunately, we're now going into what's shaping up to be a particularly warm El Nino period, right? So in the coming years, we might see especially dire impacts of this nature. So again, it's climate change and potentially disruptive policies in response to climate change that are all interacting with a variety of these other conflict drivers. So we heard about that in the Iraq or Horn of Africa context, and similar things obviously apply in the Turkey, Iran, and neighboring Iraq, Syria, other neighboring countries context. So we'll talk about water-related issues, as you said, later, but suffice it to say that in all of those countries, you've seen climate-driven declines in water, and also domestic water management decisions and politics all kind of conspire to produce, in some cases, domestic protests from agricultural communities over lack of water, and then violent crackdowns. And in the Iran case, ethnic tensions where you've seen lost agricultural livelihoods in Iraq create sort of a recruiting pool for sectarian militia recruitment, transnational tensions over these shared water resources, especially the Tigris and the Euphrates, between Turkey, Syria, Iraq, downstream neighbors. But what I would emphasize too is that, drawing on the examples that others have said already, is that it's never one of these variables in isolation, right? We have these water-related tensions going on. We have energy, right, where climate-driven drought and precipitation variability threatens things like hydropower. Like 30% of Turkey's electricity generation is from hydroelectric power, where reservoirs can be drawn down by heat waves and droughts, or things as Tobias mentioned, heat waves and increasing demand, collapsing a fragile electrical grid and causing protests. It's food, like we'll talk about later, climate-driven changes causing food to be less affordable. It's economics, where you have fossil fuel exporters potentially starting to lose out on a shrinking fossil fuel market and less able to provide economic benefits to their citizens. It's all the social and sectarian fallout of those same changes when they fall along uneven ethnic or social group lines. And again, it's not any one of those things, but it's all of them at once, right? It's the way they all interact and can potentially aggravate one another. So I'm looking forward to getting more into some of the details of those in the follow-up questions, but we definitely see those same issues playing out in Turkey, Iran, and throughout the region.
Yeah, let me just ask you as a quick follow-up. So thanks, first of all, for this broad overview. And you mentioned several times water specifically, and this is kind of the other subtopic that I wanted to get into. You, Tom, just mentioned, and I think all of our panelists so far, that these issues are not separable from one another, that it's a complex of climate change kind of trickling effects that can lead to political, but also security, directly instability. So looking specifically at water, that by definition is water scarcity and water distribution. That by definition is an issue that is more acute in the MENA region at large than in other regions. So I'd love to go into that and follow up with Tom to ask him about water scarcity, water distribution in his region, Iran and in Turkey particularly, and to what extent in the region that you're focused on, to what extent is water distribution an element that is weaponized, or it's in other instances perhaps rather an inadvertent consequence, to call it that, of other issues that are out of human control?
Definitely. So, I mean, throughout this region and MENA more generally, we see examples of climate-driven changes to water availability contributing to political or security tensions, as well as water, as you said, being weaponized in conflict by governments or non-state actors. So in the Turkey context, again, you have Turkey, Iran, Iraq, Syria, all sharing a variety of river resources that Turkey sits upstream of, especially the Tigris and Euphrates, but others as well. Turkey over the decades has built up an increasing number of dams in its southeast to make use of that water for irrigation or electricity generation. And that's been a source of tension domestically over the impact of those projects on the Kurdish minority population in that region, as well as a source of tension with downstream neighbors who are concerned that, or sometimes allege that these Turkish policies are depriving them and their communities downstream of water that they need. And I think the water experts will say accurately that you're looking historically, shared water resources are more often than not actually a source of cooperation than conflict. But I think it's also important to remember that that's not always the case, and especially in a context where we're entering unprecedented climatic changes and changes in increasingly more scarce water availability or reliability, that the past isn't necessarily prologue, and we can't necessarily count on that pattern holding. We see a similar thing in Iran, right, where you see this intersection of politics and security issues. Iran has a very dedicated effort to be food self-sufficient as part of its resistance economy. It has a very wasteful use of water for agriculture, partly because of that, and has very dire water issues domestically. And you've already seen, as I alluded to, a buildup of dams by the Iranian state, often using firms affiliated with the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, that have deprived downstream Iranian and downstream Iraqi communities of water and caused protests that have then spurred crackdowns by the Iranian regime, as well as international tensions with Iraq a couple of years ago threatening to take Iran to the International Court of Justice over its use of water. And finally, as you mentioned, the weaponization of water, you see this quite often in the region. Notable examples being for the ISIS insurgency in Iraq and Syria quite often made use of providing or depriving water to different communities as a tool to secure their support. Very famously took control of the Mosul Dam and had that as leverage over downstream communities in terms of provision of water or the potential flooding of downstream communities. So we definitely see it going both ways in this region.
You mentioned at some point cooperation or water scarcity as a good leverage for cooperation and a good excuse for that. So I'm looking really forward to asking about that towards the second part of our conversation. But I want to turn to Miret to go a little bit narrower, because I think when we think about the broader MENA region, one of the first things we think about is the Nile and the Ethiopian Dam. So much has been happening around these in terms of potential conflict, in terms of climate consequences. So can you, for us that are not deeply read into and not following every single detail, I know you do for many years, can you talk us through how these challenges have evolved around these specific examples and how you're assessing the current challenges around again, the Nile River and the Ethiopian Dam?
Thank you so much. So for everyone who does follow this intensively all the time, it is still really, really easy to get lost and to there's just, oddly enough, there's a lot going on and not very much going on in the same time, in that there's always something happening, but we don't seem to be getting anywhere. Tom mentioned something that was really, really important. He said to date, water sharing has been more about water cooperation than conflict. And it has, thank heavens. But as he also pointed out, we may see a change when it comes to, if things come down to the wire, in the sense that the less there is to share, the more people, the more nations might want to start hugging it closer to their chest. In the case of the Ethiopian Dam, we need to sort out a couple of things really, really quickly. One, as everybody knows, the Nile has 11 countries in its basin. Right, there are 11 countries that share the Nile. Egypt and Sudan are the most downstream countries, with Egypt being the most downstream country. It's at the end. It's Egypt, and then there's the Mediterranean. All right. Now, in Egypt's case, 97% of the country is desert. All right. People don't think about that because people think about the Nile, and Egypt may or may not have been referred to by Herodotus as the gift of the Nile. Apparently it wasn't, but it most certainly is the gift of the Nile. It doesn't exist without the Nile. 97% of the country is desert. Almost all of the country's drinking water comes from the Nile, and about 95% of all its water uses come from the Nile. Now, and with climate change, there are no climate change deniers in Egypt. That farmers may not be literate, but they will tell you precisely how much water they're looking at now, as opposed to 10 years ago, as opposed to 20 years ago. So there is a limited amount of water. Due to climate change, that amount of water is shrinking rapidly. You also want to bear in mind that Egypt is not a particularly rich country and has had, it's different now, but in the past it has had poor water management and an older infrastructure, which means that water was being leaked and wasted all over the place. And of course, you want to bear in mind population growth. Egypt is now 109 million people. So all of this means more strain on existing shrinking resources. Now, when the dam, the Grand Ethiopian Renaissance Dam is the largest hydroelectric power dam on the continent. It's huge, okay? Nobody knows the effect that dam is likely to have on downstream countries, simply because it's the only dam of its kind in the world that was built without an ESIA. An ESIA is an environmental sustainability and impact assessment, which tells you what's going to happen to the downstream countries. The Ethiopians refused. To cut an extremely long story short, over the last decade, Egypt and Sudan have been attempting to negotiate completely fruitlessly with Ethiopia on getting a legally binding agreement on how the dam is operated, and more importantly, an arbitration agreement. What happens if there are disagreements? Who do you go to? Now, again, we have no way of knowing how the dam is likely to affect the downstream countries. And you have, you have polar opposites saying, "Oh no, there should be no effects whatsoever." And you say, and there are those who say that it's disastrous. But generally speaking, most reputable studies will indicate that under normal circumstances, there really shouldn't be too much of an effect on the downstream countries. All right, there really shouldn't. The problems are likely to come if you have a drought. If you have a drought, this is a hydroelectric dam. They will need that water to run the turbines, okay? If there is a drought, how much water is going to be released to the downstream countries? Okay, now, droughts are usually not 1 year or 2 years, they can go on. The Horn of Africa, as we just said, is currently going through a terrible drought. The last drought seen in this area of this kind was, I think, in the early 90s, if I can remember, as Band-Aid. And at the time, Egypt was fairly conditioned from it by the Aswan Dam. But because it was a brief period and because Egypt's population at the time was about 42 million, it's now 109 million. So in Egypt's case, what is likely to happen, you want to bear in mind that Egypt and Sudan's needs are not the same here. Egypt is about 97% desert, Sudan's about 50% desert, and Sudan's concerns with the dam were not the same as Egypt's, okay? There is an overlap, but they are not the same. And people tend to, for some reason, view it as a dispute between Egypt and Ethiopia without taking into account that Sudan is quite literally in the middle. Sudan's bigger problems were not so much a lack of water, although on the first day of the filling, Sudanese water stations recorded an immediate drop in water. But they're also to do with flooding. Sudan has a terrible problem with flooding, and the dam might be good for that. However, Egypt and Sudan's concerns had enough of an overlap for them to be able to present a united front in the negotiations, which have been fruitless. The problem is, at the moment, Sudan is in civil conflict. So nobody knows what's going to happen. So what Egypt has hanging over its head at the moment is, what if we wake up one morning and there is no water? Because again, 95% of Egypt's water comes from the Nile. That is a huge potential for conflict. And hopefully it will never come to that, because nobody wants conflict. It's very, very bad news for everyone, but it is definitely a cause for concern, a cause for serious concern in Egypt.
Miret has been talking very eloquently about the different levels that water scarcity and, of course, water distribution, including through dams, is entailing at, of course, you finish with the state level, but you kind of started with the regional and the local level. And turning to Tobias, I know you, Tobias, have been working extensively on exactly these multi-level challenges. So zooming out for a bit, after looking specifically at the Nile and the dam, would you be able, zooming out into the larger MENA region, would you be able, Tobias, to talk us through what, in your understanding, when it comes to water scarcity and water distribution, what these multi-level challenges look like at the intersection of, again, national, regional, and local?
Yes, thank you. It's just another element to make the picture, the already complex picture, even a bit more complex. So as climate change and climate security is related to a lot of topics, we have the same with water, particularly in the Middle East. Climate change and water challenges are related to almost all policy fields around it. And unfortunately, we also see that when it comes to policymaking and politics, that it affects all the different levels, the local, the national, and the regional level. So we see when it comes to water allocation and water distribution, we see that there are tensions, conflicts in a water scarce area on the national level along the transboundary rivers, but also over transboundary aquifers. Very often it is not, the distribution is contested. And yeah, so there are tensions at that national, at this regional level. We also see tensions at the national level, where are investments needed in water infrastructure, which sectors, the urban areas, the rural areas, which sectors are privileged when it comes to water supplies, which ones are deprived. We have water subsidies that for irrigation and agriculture, for instance. So we have a lot of, let's say, discussions, disputes over water allocation at the national level. And we have, of course, these tensions also at the local level, at the village level, when it comes to, conflicts and tensions between tribes, religious groups, sectors, also within sectors. Is it agricultural products for the local market that need the water, or agricultural products for export, catch crops? So there are a lot of political decisions, tensions, and debates. If now such a big event as climate change or water scarcity as a slow onset event is coming to the scene, also more on short notice. If we have an acute water shortage, and sandstorms, heat waves, etc., if they are hitting a certain region, all the different levels need to be addressed one way or the other. So to put it on a more positive, to start with a positive note, if at a river basin, an upstream and a downstream country would come to an agreement over the water allocation, that of course would have a positive impact in the first place, also, let's say, downstream on the local communities, because very likely there would be a bit more water available. But if that at the same time might not be enough to address the challenges and the conflicts there, it could lead to an increase, or let's say that conflicts at the national level intensify, because if there's an agreement with another country, then it's up to the national authorities to address the shortages and the water needs that might still be there after this agreement. Also, vice versa, if we address, let's say, water challenges on the local level or at the national level, for instance, in Turkey or in Syria, that might have a severe impact again on the downstream countries, because at the Nile, but also at the Euphrates and Tigris, very often in the debate, there is a little bit this narrative that the upstream countries are using too much water, also in other places on the world, by the way, which, when it comes to the allocation and distribution and the water share, might be absolutely true. But also we should not forget that upstream countries also address their national water challenges, their national water needs. And again, then they externalize, let's say, these water challenges and bring it up to a higher level, at first place, potentially on creating a regional conflict with the downstream state, but also a local conflict at the very end, when communities might conflict over water.
Tobias, thank you. And staying with you in sort of the grand picture in the region, I want to move to the next basket that I'd love to address today, or ask you to address, and that's food security. Water means also that it's necessary for food, right? But when it comes to specifically food security, that is or can generate conflict in the MENA region, can you talk us through the extent to which food production also affects social norms, identity, and other kind of grand social issues in the region?
Yeah, thanks. The picture in your question already grouped different elements around what you could call agriculture or food production. Before Tom and Miret will look into that, we should not forget about agriculture when we discuss climate change and agriculture, fishing, forestry, and also others. When we talk about climate change, climate security, and also water and water security. So agriculture is, on the one hand, it's a food producer. And so the first impetus to address food security is to increase the production, of course, but at the same time, it is also the largest water user. It is a very vulnerable sector, vulnerable to climate change, the problems we see every year. It is a big polluter. Because under the conditions of climate change, new crops, more fertilizers are needed, which have a negative impact, of course, on the water quality in a lot of areas. We see that also efficiency in agriculture let's say there might be some room to optimize that in some areas. And also we have to look at the agricultural system, how it functions in the region. So I already mentioned before, there are subsidies in a lot of places that make this agricultural model via irrigation just possible. And so investing in agriculture would require big reforms. And these are reforms that unfortunately had not been implemented or had been delayed for several decades already, because a large amount of the population is still employed in that sector. It contributes to GDP, but it is also linked, what you mentioned, to livelihoods, to cultural and identity aspects, that if a family, for instance, had been growing rice in a certain area for dozens and even hundreds of years, it might not be a popular measure by a central government to decide from one day to the other that tomorrow you're going to have another crop to choose, because we don't have any other option. So, and of course, when we talk about identity politics, when we talk about these social norms and cultural aspects, then of course the whole transformation or the reforms which might be necessary from a hydrological or climatic point of view get even more tricky.
So narrowing it then a little bit down and turning to Tom, I want to add to our discussion the sort of the reverse effect when conflict further adds to climate security in a larger sense. And with that, I'm particularly referring to Russia's invasion of, or full-scale invasion of Ukraine, and the effects that that has had on the MENA region. I'll turn to Miret in more detail, and she and I have talked about this in previous panels over the last year several times. But I know, Tom, you're looking at these things, particularly in the context of food security, aggravated by in this case, conflict, when already there were significant vulnerabilities in the MENA region due to high imports overall in these countries of agricultural products, like Tobias was referring to earlier. So, Tom, would you give us an overview of how overall food security has been affected over the last 1.5 years in the MENA region?
Absolutely. And yeah, the impact of the war in Ukraine, Russia's invasion of Ukraine, is a good example of what we've been talking about this whole time, the interdependence and interconnectivity of all these issues, even well across borders, where you have food security being seriously undermined in the Middle East by conflict in Europe. So as you mentioned, the MENA region is especially dependent on imports for its food supply. About half of its food is imported. So that really highlights how climate or other disruptions in one part of the world can put this region at risk. And if we look back, we saw an example of this during the Arab Spring, where one among many factors that contributed to that were food price spikes after drought and wildfires in Russia reduced crop yields there, caused them to export less, contributed to rising prices. If you recall, Egyptian protesters, bread figured very prominently in the protests there because of as Tobias was mentioning, not just the livelihoods and subsidies components to that good, but also as sort of a cultural symbol as well. So we've already seen how this can be a recipe for instability or security challenges. So now with the invasion of Ukraine and the fallout from that, we've seen that the disruption of Ukrainian farming and agricultural exports, as well as all the other second and third order impacts like rising transport or fuel or energy costs that all get priced into food expenses, have led to and can continue to lead to really high food price inflation, particularly in certain countries in the Middle East, and for the communities least able to cope with those price spikes. So, year over year food price inflation, according to the most recent data, in Egypt, 63%, Turkey, 68%, Iran, 72%, Lebanon, over 260%, right? So these pressures contribute to that, potential discontent and instability risks, and make these already strained societies and governance systems and states more climate vulnerable, right? Have less adaptive capacity left to cope with further climate-driven disruptions, which we know, again, are quite likely with continued climate change and El Nino hitting, right? So what happens now in this extremely vulnerable situation already, if you have, climate or other factors leading to, again, declining crop yields that have a similar spillover effect, which is quite possible in the current situation. So it really underscores the ways that climate change can contribute to conflict, but also the way that conflict and other disruptions can worsen climate vulnerability or stand in the way of building climate resilience.
Thanks. And turning to you, Miret, you've been writing about this extensively. We've been working at MEI over this. And I remember last year, in the midst of the sort of looming food crisis due to the war, Egypt became kind of front and center with that. And I think it stayed front and center. There are many countries that are affected by reduced agricultural exports from Ukraine, but Egypt, with its economy and with its significant population, with, again, a significant dependence on Ukrainian as well as Russian grain, has been directly affected and has been front and center. So if you're thinking back to last year and kind of going through the economic crisis, the significant aid that Egypt has needed from other countries in the MENA region, can you talk us through what the biggest challenges are now compared to 1 year ago, and how significant the crisis is, or what you're expecting, how you're expecting the crisis that Egypt is facing in the larger picture, economically, but also food security-wise in the next few months?
You want that in 3 minutes? Because I don't think we can do that in 3 minutes, but I will do my absolute best. As far as food security is concerned, the problem during the Russian full-scale invasion of Ukraine was that Egypt is the world's largest grain importer, right? And 50% of that grain comes from Russia and 30% comes from Ukraine. So you can imagine how exciting life was for a while with the Egyptian government scrambling desperately to try and get, even though, so they had seen this coming, they did try and do the responsible thing and try and stockpile. They did. The problem is wars do not start at 7 a.m. and finish at 12:30 p.m. I mean, you don't know what's going to happen. So not only was there less grain, it became more expensive. So the Egyptians were spending more out of their budget, out of a depleting amount of hard currency to try and buy this grain. And then you had, as far as the Egyptian economy was concerned, to cut an extremely long story short, you had a couple of things that were not the fault of the Egyptian government, the pandemic and the Russian crisis. And they seriously impacted a few things that were directly the Egyptian government, successive Egyptian government's fault, which was the failure to undergo various structural reforms that were necessary for the economy. I mean, again, I'm just keeping this short. So what we have at the moment is, in some things, it is a mirror of the global economy. Their monetary policy pretty much is mirroring global monetary policy at the moment. Rising inflation, higher interest rates to try and counter that inflation. However, you have other problems that are completely homegrown. There is a serious lack of foreign currency because Egypt had supported its own pound against the dollar for a long time artificially. There was less currency. There were problems with imports because they need foreign currency. You have higher interest rates. Inflation has just shot to an all-time high of about 40%, which makes life extremely difficult for the average Egyptian. I mean, there is a litany, without getting into it, there is a serious problem. The only good thing about it is that all of the structural reforms that successive Egyptian governments should have made over the last 30 years and did not make for various political considerations, they are probably going to have to make now because they've run out of space. I think I've compared the way they ran the economy to basically being on a skateboard without a helmet. You're fine as long as you don't hit anything. All right, but they did. They hit a couple of things, then fell straight down a hole. All right, so they're going to have to make those structural adjustments. And the last IMF loan, which was of 3 billion, came with 3 conditions. One of which was to free float the exchange, which they started on, but I don't think is going to, in my opinion, there will not be another devaluation, probably not until after the elections at the moment, because there just isn't the hard currency to back it up. I mean, there really isn't very much they can do about that. There isn't going to be another devaluation at the moment, but the market in which the state has played an outsized role to the detriment of both domestic and foreign private investors is going to have to step back. So there is a privatization program in place. So they are going to have to make those changes, one would hope. Okay. That's the economic side. On food security, you have a problem in that the amount of land isn't changing. The amount of water is decreasing. You want to remember that Egypt is like many countries, bizarrely enough, in the Middle East, Egypt is an agrarian economy. About 30% of the population is directly involved in agriculture. And if you take the indirect, you know, whether you're transporting tomatoes or whether you have a company that makes ketchup, about 60% of the labor force is involved there. I mean, that's astonishing for a country that is 97% desert. So you have more people, you have fewer resources, you've got less water, you've got climate change. It is a difficult mix, and they are going to have to, in line with all countries of the region, they are really, really going to have to rethink and adapt to what is happening. We can come to that later. But for your earlier, it's not really about mitigation, it's about adaptation.
I want to follow up right on that because you kind of pointed exactly to that towards the end, to ask you broadly, I know it's like 30 minutes, not 3, but nevertheless, to ask you to squeeze into a few minutes in the last bucket, recommendations of what can be done. Thinking back to the sort of buckets that we've looked at, food security, water security, and climate change overall, looking at Egypt, as well as you've pointed out exactly that Egypt is a great example at a higher scale of many countries in the MENA region. What you would recommend going forward when it comes to exactly what you're pointing to, adaptation instead of political kind of patchwork solutions?
As you said, Egypt isn't unusual in this case. The entire region is going to have to adapt. But for some countries, it's going to be easier. Egypt is in the basket of countries that is going to need help on the adapting. The entire world is struggling with climate financing, all right, financing for adaptation and mitigation. I think I remember reading somewhere that developing countries are going to need about, not counting China. It's funny that China is counted as a developing country, but it is. Okay, so not counting China, developing countries are going to require about $2.4 trillion dollars in the next decade or something to work on climate financing. I have no idea where that money is going to come from if it isn't mostly from external financing. And it is an odd thing, but to date, the vast bulk of climate financing that has come in from developed countries goes to other developed countries that are already working on their emissions. And I mean, essentially, the developing countries are not getting enough climate financing for them to work on problems that, I mean, honestly, that they had no part in. I mean, the entire continent of Africa is responsible for about 3% of all climate emissions. So it's just, it's not fair. But everyone needs to rethink what they're doing. You need to rethink what plants, what crops are being grown. I mean, it's one of the reasons why Egyptian cotton is famous, but I really don't think that they're going to be able to grow it much longer because it's so water intensive. That's one of the reasons why Egypt is the world's, which used to be the world's breadbasket, is now the world's largest importer. We don't have the water. So you need to think about what crops you're going to, you need to think about what kind of construction you're doing, because you want to remember that construction is one of the world's largest users of water. So what kind of construction, what kind of buildings you're on, what kind of roads you're going to plant, you need to think about population control. You need to think about growing crops that are more resilient to heat and change, and you need to make the shift over to renewable energy. Now, the region actually is in a good place for renewable energy because it has sunshine and it has wind, and it's in a decent place to try and be able to do it. But to do that, it requires the financing. So that's a sort of very, very, very brief thing. But you need a rethink, and you need money, and you need to do it very, very fast.
Thank you, Mairet. And turning to Tobias to ask again the broad picture as we are wrapping up and looking ahead. When we're looking at the MENA region and of course beyond, but specifically to the MENA region, we're looking at the need for policy as well as the need for concrete action, like US panelists have illustrated again and again in several examples. So taking again a macro perspective on the region, what would your recommendations be when we're looking at both framework and action?
Yeah, thanks. I think it's important to what you just pointed out, that we are aware that we bring these debates and discourses and the concrete action always together, because what we see at the moment, or what I see at the moment very often, is a big framework of climate security, which is of course needed to promote the complexity of this, to promote the comprehensive action, to illustrate the complexity of the issue, to foster coordinated approaches, etc. It's simply there to address the whole phenomenon that we see. But at the same time, we should not forget that when we talk about concrete action, this action has to take place in, let's say, more traditional sectors, in various sectors, be it water, be it agriculture, be it transportation. Every sector has to adapt, to address, let's say, the climate security challenges. And as I mentioned before, very often we talk about adaptation here. And here in these sectors, there we have these unprecedented challenges. Here we have the tough decisions that need to be taken. And here, for the first time, in a lot of cases, we come to absolute red lines. The increasing temperatures have been a phenomenon over the last 20, 30 years already. More recently, the curves went steeper up, but we reach now the point where we have to ask, under which conditions is the human body still functioning when the outside temperatures are 55 degrees Celsius for several days in a row. So the health sector will have specific answers to that. But here then also, as I said, decisions have to be taken. And the problem is that, in these sectors, they all have a history of debates, of discourses, of political failures. So very often the proposed, let's say, tools and policies to address the wider climate security phenomena, the tools are the same that were proposed years ago to address other phenomena. For instance, just to bring down water consumption, for example. And here we also have, we run into a situation where we need also to discuss very, very tough topics, which are considered to be political no-goes. So for instance, exit of agriculture in certain areas in which it might not be possible at a certain point. Also the question of resettlements of people and let's say coordinated migration to protect people from what is happening. And so when we have to address these massive challenges in these sectors, the climate change, climate adaptation, and climate security narrative sometimes might stand a little bit in the way, because given the complexity, let's say, for the debate, as I said, which is important, does not necessarily help to move on, to progress with concrete action on the ground.
Yeah, it's certainly not comfortable political decisions that decision makers will want to take and then bear responsibility for that. So we're getting into the same kind of spiral that we have with so many security issues, including with climate change. Turning to Tom with the ultimate challenge, 2 questions, if you can address them both in a few minutes, and then wrapping it up and turning back to Mohammed to close us up. I want to ask you about the role of challenges, I guess, and possible institutional solutions to the problems that we're facing in terms of climate change in the MENA region. First is the role of disinformation, and I'm going to throw in there a question or a more targeted question that we've gotten from our audience from Lindsay O'Neill about Russia and China's influence, that are both known also for disinformation when it comes to the MENA region or any other region. And then also, finally, I know that you've been doing a lot of work on this kind of emerging area, and that is how militaries can adapt to help in disaster relief in the context of climate change and climate security. So, Tom, the floor is yours.
Sure, thanks. I'll do my best to address all those things. I mean, I think just to very, very briefly echo some of the things Marit and Tobias were saying, before we get to things like disinformation or militaries involved in climate relief, we've seen from this discussion that obviously there's no way around the need to rapidly reduce greenhouse gas emissions, because there's hard limits to what you can adapt to, and you need more investment in climate resilience from the outside. And I think we've seen why those are not just the right thing to do for countries like the US and others, but a prudent security investment that pays dividends when you compare it to the costs of the type of instability and conflict we might want to avoid. But yeah, looking to those challenges you mentioned, I mean, these are some of the things that, in addition to what we've been spending most of this time discussing in terms of climate-driven conflicts or resource-related security challenges, I think are things that we'll need to think about, and that underscore the ways that these climate security challenges will also manifest in more subtle social and political ways. So on the misinformation or disinformation front, this is something that me and my colleagues have been thinking more about recently, the ways that these climate-driven disruptions and the responses to them are likely to worsen misinformation and disinformation, whether organically spread or spread by an outside actor like China or Russia, right? Both in the sense of supplying motivations for people to spread disinformation, whether that's to protect their economic interests as tough economic decisions are made about subsidies or fossil fuels, or whether it's to deflect blame for mismanagement of a climate disaster, right? And also by making sort of the demand, so to speak, the receptivity to misinformation and disinformation worse among populations as they become disaffected, might lose trust in political and social institutions amidst these strains. And on the China and Russia front, I mean, this is another area where, not just in this region, but worldwide, where showing responsiveness to these adaptation needs in countries that are facing these vulnerabilities also helps, protect alliances and partnerships that the U.S. and its allies have against competing claims from people like Russia or China, who would seek to use a gap between the needs and what we're providing to exploit and build their own relationships there. And I know that's a very brief treatment of that front. That could be its own whole panel. But the other angle on the militaries being involved in relief for climate hazards like floods and wildfires, this is an area where there's quite a lot of attention paid to the impact of climate change on militaries, in the sense of the impact of floods or heat waves on training and facilities and military readiness and conflict, like we discussed. But the other angle that we've been thinking about more recently is that militaries are often, the first responders by default to disaster relief, to provide relief for floods or heat waves or other things, wildfires. And they're the first responders by default, whether they respond sufficiently well to that demand or not. They have widely varying political roles, human rights records, capabilities, priorities, et cetera. So we recently launched this tracking project, the Military Responses to Climate Hazards project, to try to map this worldwide, where military is being called in this way. And it really brings to mind questions about military's political and social roles, right? Where you have governments in the region who are of a military character, right? What does it mean if they respond repressively or incompetently to a climate hazard? You have countries with a history of coups, right? What does the military's responsiveness to public needs for relief mean for civil military relations, right? What does it mean for human rights if militaries are bringing a repressive or sort of preferential distribution of relief to different communities? So these are some areas we think are important to keep on the radar in the coming years, in addition to the already very serious, near-term conflict issues that we've been discussing today.
Tom, thank you for talking us through through some of these possible solutions as well as challenges in the next few years, as we're looking into climate security and climate change, climate security, and the MENA region. To me, I'll keep my remarks very short, because I want to turn to Mohammed to wrap us up. But to me, this discussion has reinforced how broad the spectrum, both broad and deep, the spectrum is of climate-related challenges in the MENA region, whether it's concrete things such as the relationship between conflict and climate changes, and concrete things such as food scarcity, food security, water scarcity, or if it is about the consequences to which all of you pointed throughout kind of our buckets that we went through, and that is the social implications, whether that's related to lower trust in institutions in countries across the region, or the consequences when it comes to how these issues can be addressed when you already have an overall lower trust. Part of it, of course, is political, depending on each country, as in any other region, but part of it is kind of exacerbated, social issues exacerbated by the nexus between climate and security. So with that, I want to give a big thank you to all of our panelists and, of course, to our audience for listening in, tuning in, and asking questions. And I'll turn to Mohammed to wrap us up and tell us what we should be expecting for tomorrow.
Thank you so much, Julia. Just if I could chime in on a couple of things that I kind of overheard in your conversation that resonated with me. I really appreciated that you all really covered the range of topics that fell under this umbrella in terms of the consequences of heat waves and warming on the public health dimension, how all of the things you talked about trickle down and effect on the economic side of things, so that affecting the stability side. But I think the thing that obviously selfishly resonated for me the most is the water security angle, which is an area that's dear to me, and how it can pose both being an enabler and prohibitor, right, in terms of or pushing forward action in terms of either being weaponized in physical conflict or almost an olive branch towards cooperation. And then, of course, the big link to food security and food production. And all of those are very, very critical components. I really appreciated that discussion. And then, being very honest about this is a difficult topic because the solutions are not simple and are challenging. So I appreciate the honesty and not sugarcoating some of those points. I think it's important to be clear about that as well. And I appreciate you all delving on the topic that tends to lean more towards the I'll say it crudely political side of things, which is completely out of my sphere. So I appreciate you all dipping our toes in those waters because I am not so brave. So I just wanted to conclude thanking you all, Julia, Tom, Tobias, and Miret. Really appreciate your insight and your time and participation. I think this was a wonderful panel. I will also mention to our audience that this has been recorded. And as soon as we're done, we'll post on MEI's YouTube website, as well as the event website where pretty much everyone came to register for this event. It'll post there as well. So I know we have an international audience, and so sometimes we don't necessarily have everyone tuning in live. In fact, a lot of our sort of repeat viewing does come, our viewing does come from the recorded segment. So feel free to share those to others as well, those of you that have been watching. In terms of previewing our next day, so tomorrow is going to be our panel and theme focusing on energy transition and the green circular economy. And we actually will have our keynote for the week preceding that panel tomorrow, which I'll just mention is Her Excellency Dr. Nawal Hosseini, who is from the UAE, and she is the UAE's permanent representative in IRENA, which is the International Renewable Energy Agency. So that'll be very, look forward to that in terms of her remarks. And then we'll transition into a really excellent panel focusing on the energy transition, which, is going to be one of the big topics moving into COP28 later this year. So with that, thank you all very much, participants, moderator, panelists, and we look forward to you tuning in the rest of the week as well. Take care for now.